Before going into detail about any of these different incidents in history that you write about, would you give us, first of all, give us an overview of what this book's about?
The book, Getting It Wrong, discusses and debunks 10 media-driven myths. And these are stories about and or by the news media that are widely believed and often retold. These are prominent stories about journalism and journalists. But these stories, under close inspection, under scrutiny, dissolve as apocryphal or wildly exaggerated. And I characterize them as akin to the junk food of journalism. They're appetizing, they're appealing, they're tantalizing, but they're not terribly nutritious or healthy in the long run.
I want to do this quickly and then come back to some of them.
Okay.
Let's go down the 10. I'll read off the chapter and you can just give us a little paraphrase on all this. Number 1, I'll furnish the war, the making of a media myth.
That was William Randolph Hearst's famous vow to furnish the war with Spain at the end of the 19th century. It's a widely known, widely believed, and widely retold anecdote. It's perhaps the best known anecdote in American journalism. It's certainly one of the oldest. It's almost certainly untrue. Hearst himself denied having said that.
2, fright beyond measure, the myth of the War of the Worlds.
The War of the Worlds radio dramatization of October 1938 by Orson Welles. Great radio entertainment, a very inspired show. Orson Welles was 23 when he did this. And it supposedly set off nationwide panic and mass hysteria. But on close inspection of the available evidence, there is very little to indicate that that was the case. Almost certainly apocryphal.
3, Murrow versus McCarthy, timing makes the myth.
Indeed. The Edward R. Murrow, the famous Edward R. Murrow show, See It Now, in March 1954, supposedly stopped Joe McCarthy, Senator Joe McCarthy, in his tracks in his communist and government witch hunt. But in reality, Edward R. Murrow was very late to taking on McCarthy. Other journalists had been addressing McCarthy in his bullying ways for months, if not years, before Murrow finally took him on. So Murrow was very late, and he acknowledged it too.
4, the Bay of Pigs, New York Times suppression myth.
The notion that the New York Times, under pressure from the Kennedy administration, spiked or held back or suppressed its reporting about the pending invasion of the Bay of Pigs in April 1961 is the heart of that myth. But close inspection, reading what the New York Times printed, for one thing, quite clearly shows that they reported an awful lot in a lot of detail. And there was no evidence at all that Kennedy ever, in advance of publication, asked the Times to hold back or suppress any of its pre-invasion stories. 5, debunking the CRONKITE moment. The CRONKITE moment. That's probably one of American journalism's best-known anecdotes, certainly of the 20th century. Walter Cronkite's famous program at the end of February 1968 supposedly altered American war policy and swung public opinion against the war and forced or prompted Lyndon Johnson to reconsider running for re-election. All of that is untrue.
6, the nuanced myth, bra burning at Atlantic City.
Bra burning at Atlantic City. That was a protest by the. It was a feminist protest, one of the first feminist protests of the 1960s, late 60s, and they protested the Miss America pageant in 1968, which was held at Atlantic City. And during the protest, they discarded into a large trash can, which they called the Freedom Trash Can, instruments of what they called torture for women, and that included bras and girdles and high-heeled shoes, as well as issues of Cosmopolitan and Playboy magazines. The notion is that the feminists set fire to their bras and waved them demonstratively over their heads in a really fiery public spectacle. My research shows that that's almost certainly untrue, that if the bras and other items were set on fire, it was very briefly in the Freedom Trash Can at this demonstration in '68. 7, it's all about the media, Watergate's heroic journalist myth. Yes, the heroic journalist myth of Watergate. The notion that 2 intrepid and young investigative reporters for the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, through their investigative reporting, brought down Richard Nixon's corrupt presidency. It's a very beguiling notion. It's a very appealing, delicious story, but it's untrue. Even the Washington Post principals, Woodward himself among them, have said over the years that the Post did not bring down Richard Nixon. What brought down Nixon was a combination, if you will, of forces, including federal prosecutors, federal judges, the U.S. Supreme Court, bipartisan congressional panels. All of those were at work to bring down Nixon and expose the depth and dimensions and extent of the Watergate scandal. About 20 people went to jail for their criminality, and these were either associated with Nixon or working for his re-election campaign in 1972.
8, the fantasy panic, the news media, and the crack baby myth.
The crack baby myth is supposedly that women who took crack cocaine during pregnancy would give birth to offspring who would be forever dependent. And some commentators, both on the political left and political right, forecast that there would be this bio-underclass of dependent young people. As they grew up, they would be wards of the state, essentially. And there would be this huge number of people who were forever damaged by the prenatal exposure to crack cocaine. It seems not to have been the case, that crack was not the... I mean, it's not a good idea to take this stuff during pregnancy or at any time, but nonetheless, it didn't seem to have that effect. There is no crack baby syndrome, as there is a fetal alcohol syndrome.
Number 9, quote, she was fighting to the death, unquote, myth-making in Iraq.
Myth-making in Iraq. Jessica Lynch, the 19-year-old young woman who was caught in an ambush in the early days of the Iraq War and was taken prisoner and then later rescued by a U.S. commando team early in April 2003. And Jessica Lynch's battlefield heroics were reported by the Washington Post. These were quite incorrect, quite in error, and the Post story about Jessica Lynch fighting to the death in Iraq was untrue, and turned out to be almost certainly a case of mistaken identity. That it wasn't Jessica Lynch in that unit who was fighting to the death; it was another person, Sergeant Donald Walters.
And finally, 10. Hurricane Katrina and the myth of superlative reporting.
Right, Hurricane Katrina. It was the landfall of Hurricane Katrina was in 2005, and supposedly the news media were aggressive in their reporting and calling attention to the defects in the response, the state, local, and federal response to the hurricane. But also, in addition, the news media coverage of the extent of the damage and the extent of the lawlessness that supposedly was unleashed by Hurricane Katrina was quite wrong. It was hardly a moment of superlative reporting. The news media got that story quite wrong. Estimates of death tolls that exceeded 10,000 were wrong by an order of magnitude. The fact that the widespread looting, widespread pillaging, raping, murders were going on in New Orleans in the aftermath of the hurricane, all that was untrue. And it had the effect of really impugning a city and its people at an hour of their most urgent need.